Hi there, Mel here from Synthesis Health Lab, and in a previous video we went over what the cell danger response is, which is basically how each of our cells responds to any sort of threat or stressor. And then we also went through what the first stage of the cell danger response looks like. That's our innate immune response and all of the typical signs of inflammation. And in this video, we're going to go through what happens in the second step, which is a really common phase for modern people to get stuck in and underlies a lot of complex chronic illness. This is the adaptive immune system and also focused on tissue repair. Now, before we dive in, if you have a complex chronic health issue and you're looking for some help to figure out kind of where to start healing and how to get through it, then consider applying for the Synthesis Health Solutions and Support Program. It's completely free if you're accepted, and you can ask me any questions that you have there, and you can join a group of really great people who are on the same path as you. All right, so let's look at cell danger response 2 and what is going on there. So as a brief recap, when a cell is stressed or injured, it goes through 3 distinct steps to heal, which are coordinated by the mitochondria. This 3-step process and the integration of signals and healing phases between the local mitochondria at the site of infection or inflammation and organs, tissues, the nervous system, and the organism is called the cell danger response. These 3 steps have distinct checkpoints and metabolism, and they correspond to 3 distinct mitochondrial modes. So if you ever hear someone saying, oh, you gotta take this supplement to support your mitochondria, that doesn't make any sense. It doesn't exist because mitochondria are doing different things in different modes. So it really doesn't matter what the stressor is. It could be trauma or stress, infections, mycotoxins, air pollution, food additives, whatever it is. Each cell is going to go through a very similar, if not the same, 3-step process to heal. And we looked at when a cell is healthy, it follows the daily pattern of light and dark cycles and temperature fluctuations and is changing and dynamically adapting its metabolism according to natural rhythms. And then when it's stressed or infected or poisoned, then it leaves this health cycle and then it enters the healing cycle, and it goes through CDR1 or cell danger response 1, CDR2, and then CDR3 in that order. And once it completes those steps, then it becomes a healthy cell again. When a cell is stressed or damaged, it shifts into stage 1 of the cell danger response, which is about defense, containment, and activation of the innate immune system. Organs need a certain number of cells to function, and when cells are lost through damage, they need to be replaced. So here we enter CDR2. So once the initial damage from the injury, infection, or toxin has been cleared or contained in CDR1, cells shift into CDR2 and enter the cell cycle. So we can see here that in each stage we're doing something different. And in CDR1, mitochondria were in what is known as M1 metabolism, which is like a pro-inflammatory metabolism. And in CDR2, they're in what's called M0, which is like a uncommitted, immature mode where they're stem cells, and they're basically new, fresh cells replenishing and replacing damaged tissue. So let's take a look at the cell cycle, because that's really what CDR2 is all about. So cells are in an immature, uncommitted state. And whereas fatty acids were being used for inflammation in the first step of the cell danger response, now they are being used for tissue growth. The NLRP3 inflammasome, which we talked about in the CDR1, the production is actually low. Now that's interesting because that's really associated with the first stage of the immune response. And so while conditions and diseases that are associated with CDR2, like obesity and diabetes and cancer, are associated with inflammation, it's not this inflammation. So when people are suggesting that you take all these anti-inflammatory drugs or supplements or foods, it's not necessarily based on an accurate understanding of physiology. Mitochondria are using something called Warburg metabolism for energy. So instead of making energy in the way that healthy cells do, they're usually in a low oxygen environment, and they are using ATP, which is that energy, for making new tissue rather than making energy. Mitochondria are somewhere between the spaghetti and meatball configurations. So you can see that mitochondria can either exist as these thin filamental forms where they're all networked and web-like, or they can be punctate where they're separate. And so in CDR2, they're somewhere in between. Now in CDR2, cells have a low susceptibility to something called apoptosis, which is programmed cell death. And so when a cell is dysfunctional or or damaged in any way, then we want to have a way to get rid of it. But in CDR2, in the cell cycle, it's all about growing and replacing. And so cells in that mode really don't tend to get killed by apoptosis. And there's also lower DNA quality control because that's not the purpose of the mode. The purpose of that mode is growth and repair. Now, in addition to a stressor or trigger or infection, another way to trigger the cell cycle or CDR2 outside of what would be healthy and normal is simply just to eat too much. So proteins can trigger this, especially if they contain an amino acid called leucine and other branched chain amino acids. These signal to cells to grow. Too many calories, too many carbs, just really kind of a modern situation of a lot of ultra processed food. It's not so much that the cells get damaged, but that the energy cue is that the cell should start growing. Now, I mentioned leucine, and interestingly, and not at all coincidentally, leucine is the most abundant amino acid in breast milk. And of course, the purpose of breast milk, part of the purpose of breast milk is to provide nutrition for a rapidly growing infant. And so we see this link in nature between the amino acid that's present there and the cue and signal to grow. Conditions that are associated with being stuck in too much CDR2 metabolism are cancers and leukemias, heart disease, dyslipidemia, diabetes, fatty liver, obesity, fibroids, PCOS, basically any sort of disease that is characterized by uncontrolled growth would be characterized by too much CDR2 and being stuck and not being able to move on. So now let's just take a look at some problems with common approaches to these issues. Just as common approaches to dealing with CDR1 conditions involve blocking CDR1, blocking the healing response with anti-inflammatories, approaches to CDR2 illnesses fail to recognize that these conditions and symptoms are due to a healing cycle that's gotten stuck. So in terms of approaches to cancer, industrial medicine still looks at cancer as primarily stemming from mutations, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that this is not usually the best place to look. However, there are mutations, but they are typically preceded by shifts to cell danger response 2. And this is a really excellent look at what is called the metabolic theory of cancer, which I would say fits under the umbrella of the cell danger response. So it's like the theory of cancer in the cell danger response. And so just a quick quote from this book: once this call is made, and that call really is the stress response of the cell, and DNA responds, the entire complexion of the cell changes, right? It changes modes. It begins to exhibit the hallmark features of cancer: uncontrolled proliferation, genomic instability, the increased probability that DNA mutation will occur, evasion of cell death, and so forth. The process is probably an ancient mechanism designed to nurture cells through transient moments when little oxygen was available that undoubtedly occurred as the planet's first cells evolved toward increasing complexity. A primordial survival mechanism, a vestige of our evolutionary past. The upshot, according to Seyfried, who's a researcher who wrote a book in 2012 on this subject, is that the mutations to DNA thought to precipitate and drive the disease are only a side effect, sending researchers on a multi-decade, multi-billion-dollar wild goose chase. So if we look at what's going on in CDR2, what we have is that we have damaged tissue, and then the purpose of CDR2 is to replace that tissue by having cells rapidly divide and grow. Now, when the damage continues long term and the body has to keep that up, then DNA mutations will start to appear eventually, right? Because the builders are getting tired, okay? But it's not, in most cancers, it's not the mutations that cause the problem to begin with. And so the approaches usually fall under the categories of cut, poison, and burn, and all of these approaches fail to identify triggers of the CDR or to help support resolution of the healing response. And something like chemotherapy preferentially targets cells in cell danger response 2, which is cancer, but also normal healthy cells that have a high turnover rate, like the endothelial lining of skin, of organs, of reproductive systems, and of hair. Now, if we take a look at heart disease, which is also another condition associated with too much CDR2, then the primary focus has been on lowering cholesterol. And cholesterol is used by the body to repair damaged vessels. It's also used for making cell membranes and the skin and the brain, and for making all steroid hormones. So here's the deal. If you don't get anything else from this video, we need to stop talking about good and bad cholesterol. It's ridiculous. There is only one type of cholesterol, and it's either in the high density lipoprotein, HDL, it's either going from the tissues back to the liver and gallbladder, or it's in the low density lipoprotein and it's going from the liver to the blood vessels in order to repair them. Right? So it's going there to repair damage, and it's going there to help build new cell walls. So about 50% of every one of your cell walls is made of cholesterol. And so if there's a situation where your body needs to heal something like a cut or infection, it part of what it needs to do is send cholesterol from the liver to that area. And so that's what we're seeing when we're looking at associations between cholesterol profiles and health outcomes. But what we see consistently in the literature is that total cholesterol is not only not associated with disease or cardiovascular disease, it's actually protective. So this was a study that was looking at over 50,000 high-risk people. So what you're looking at here is a graph that's showing the association between cholesterol and all-cause mortality. So that's death from any cause. And you can see this green line is looking at total cholesterol, and the rate ratios are looking at death. And so anything that's below this line here of 1 means that they were less likely to die. What you see is that the higher their cholesterol, the less likely to die they were, right? All the way out here. And it only goes up when people were like outliers of extremely high cholesterol. But really the association is robust. Even over the 90th percentile in terms of their cholesterol levels was a decreased risk of death. So that's really quite interesting. And if we look at, this is an interesting paper that's looking at the relationship between statins, cholesterol, and cancer. And this is colorectal cancer. And initially what has been argued is that there's that statins help prevent cancer. But what this study was trying to tease out is whether or not it's the statins that are lowering the cancer risk, or whether it was that the people who were put on statins had high cholesterol, and that was what was lowering their cancer risk. And that's actually what these guys found. So they looked at 22,000 cancer patients compared to 86,000 controls. And what they found was that there was a small decreased risk of cancer associated with statin use. But then they tested 2 other things. The first was that among people who were using statins, if they discontinued using the statins, it had no change on cancer risk. So that was interesting. But the other thing was that increased serum cholesterol was independently associated with decreased risk of colorectal cancer. So the higher people's cholesterol, the lower the risk of cancer. And so really the studies that show this relationship between statins and cancer are actually, it's a misattribution. So really that the true relationship was that their cholesterol was high, and that's what was preventing cancer. And so here you can see on the study that here, if the higher the cholesterol levels, the lower the risk of cancer. Now, this was an interesting study showing that statins may facilitate Parkinson's disease. And what they looked at was a database of health insurance claims, and they found a positive association between statin use and Parkinson's. But just from that, it's unclear if people were already unhealthy and then they were put on statins and then they developed Parkinson's disease, or if there was any sort of cause and effect relationship. But the really interesting thing they found was that there was a stronger association in initial use, which means that people who were put onto statins were then more likely to develop Parkinson's disease within a short period of time. And that indicates that the cholesterol was actually playing a protective role of keeping the Parkinson's at bay, which is really consistent with how we know that physiology works. And then looking at another extremely common CDR2 associated illness, diabetes, just a quick look at the problems with using metformin, which is a very common, long used first line drug for diabetes. So what the research shows is that it does lower blood sugar, but it causes alterations in the gut microbiome. And the gut microbiome is really important for overall health. Most researchers now consider it to be like another organ. So damaging it is like organ damage. And it causes digestive symptoms. And those digestive symptoms are actually indicating a problem with absorption of nutrition. And so what the research shows very consistently is that it can cause deficiencies in vitamin B12 and iron. And both of those can be potentially serious. So it can increase risk of dementia and neuropathies and other not so good things. And it can also cause kidney damage. Now, what metformin is doing is really interesting. It increases something called AMPK, and that is an energy sensor that all of our cells have, and it goes up in the winter. It's really a winter signaling molecule. So we have a smaller fluctuation on a daily basis, but animals, including humans, use this to sense when things are colder. And so basically that we're going to be using our own energy stores for energy rather than having abundant food. And so that is how metformin is helping with blood sugar control and to help some of these diseases of too much summer metabolism work. But the problem is that by forcing the body into a winter metabolism, then you have other effects. So for example, this study showed that metformin causes exercise intolerance. And so they looked at patients who were just put on it, and it decreased oxygen uptake, and it showed other issues. So 6 weeks of treatment with metformin significantly decreases exercise capacity in newly diagnosed patients with metabolic syndrome. Now, because we know that it's increasing winter metabolism, then that is a really predictable outcome. That just makes sense, right? That if you're basically giving the body a drug to tell it that it's winter, then you're going to have other winter effects as well. It's like hibernation, right? So we're going to have decreased exercise tolerance and less energy essentially, because that's what we're signaling to the body. Now, there are also a lot of issues with how functional medicine handles this group of illnesses. Now, they do tend to have a more helpful, more systems-based approach than industrial medicine. But here's the thing. So this is from the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control website, and you can see that 6 in 10 adults in the US have a chronic disease. And then if you look down here, you can see what they are. And hopefully you should see a theme here that pretty much all of them are CDR2 diseases, right? And that's why they tend to go together, like heart disease and diabetes and Alzheimer's disease and stroke and cancer, and kidney, they'll go together because they're not really separate things. They're just one thing. And so then what happens is that we end up getting people making these blanket recommendations that are perhaps helpful and relevant and appropriate for people with these conditions, but not everyone who has a chronic illness has those conditions. A lot of people have conditions that are nothing to do with CDR2, that are really more of CDR3 or CDR1. And so making these recommendations as if they were relevant for everyone when they're not relevant for most people is a really big problem. And I think it harms a lot of patients. So just as an example of this, I'm going to pick on this book a little bit. So this is written by a doctor called Dr Perlmutter, who I have great respect for, but this book was problematic. And so basically what it's saying is that everyone's going to be a lot healthier if they lower their uric acid levels. Now, high uric acid levels are associated with CDR2, so obesity, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, cancer. And so if you have high levels of uric acid, then it is helpful to lower them. And if we can just be a little bit more global about it, if you're stuck in CDR2 and if you're stuck in that metabolism, then we should want to stop triggering that response and help you move through the healing cycle, right? But in this case, he's made it seem like it's like a principle of health. And from my perspective, it simply isn't, right? A lot of people have uric acid levels that are actually too low. And in the research that he cites in his paper, there were more women who had mortality and morbidity associated with uric acid levels that were too low than too high. And yet his recommendations were for everyone, men or women, to aim for the same target levels and to make them pretty much as low as possible, but not worried about the lower cutoff. And so this is just an example of someone who's looking at a CDR2 illness and then making blanket recommendations as if this is the missing key to health. And it's really just missing the bigger picture. And for someone who already has low uric acid levels or is not in that state, it's actually going to cause them harm if they follow this. So what we really need is a systems approach to healing. So we want to systematically identify, remove, and manage triggers. And we want to support the body through stages of healing using a step-by-step approach and working with how your body evolved to heal. So in our group, we go through the 4 stages of healing, and this is really consistent with cell danger response and how we heal, and also translating that up to us as a person and not just ourselves. And so we combine what we know from a variety of sources to work with your body and to take you through a process. So we saw how with conditions and symptoms that are associated with too much CDR1, like too much histamine, all that, too much inflammation, that the standard approach is just to try to block the inflammation with anti-inflammatory approaches. And with CDR2, it tends to try to just block summer metabolism altogether and bring it down here. So that's what it's trying to do. But really what we want to do is to identify the triggers and then help remove the blockages to moving forward so that we can heal. Most approaches to healing complex chronic illness fail because they either try to block the healing response or they go out of order. For chronic cell danger response 2 associated issues, most approaches try to turn off summer metabolism, which has off-target effects. Because here's the problem, people are not recognizing that these issues are a result of a healthy process that's being used too much. And so they're associating that process with disease and they're trying to block it altogether. And I think that's a mistake, right? So we want to recognize that actually, if we can cycle through like we were designed to do, then these things become healthy, and blocking them can actually lead to other problems. So health is about cycling between summer and winter and day and night. Most health influencers are categorizing everyone as if this obesity, metabolic syndrome, diabetes, and cancer was their problem. And it is for a lot of people, but it may not be for you. So maybe you have a different pattern. So maybe you have chronic fatigue or fibromyalgia or autoimmune conditions or long haulers or things like that are associated with almost the opposite physiology. And maybe you're trying to do your best to follow all these guys and it's not helping or it's making things worse. And this is really a kind of clear way to understand why. So by removing blockages in the healing cycle and supporting the body to resolve its response, we can systematically heal from complex chronic illness. So that is a look at what is going on with a persistent CDR2 response. And in the next video, we're going to look at what goes on with cell danger response 3, which is all about communication and integration and some of the symptoms and conditions that are associated with it and how we can move forward. So I look forward to seeing you there. Take care.